The thunder cracked across the Montana sky like a whip against leather, startling Bethany Darrow's mare into a frightened whinny. It was the spring of 1878, and Bethany had never felt more alone or more foolish. The rain came suddenly, pelting down in angry sheets that quickly soaked through her riding clothes and plastered her auburn hair against her face. Her brother's warnings echoed in her mind as clearly as the thunder now rolling overhead. Don't stray too far from town, Beth. The weather shifts quick in these parts. But Bethany, 22 and brimming with the particular stubbornness that had carried her west from Boston just 3 months prior, had ignored Walter's advice. The wildflowers blooming across the prairie had beckoned her farther and farther from the safety of Helena, until the gathering storm clouds had finally commanded her attention too late. "Easy, girl," Bethany soothed her nervous mare, her gloved hands already slick on the reins. The temperature was dropping fast, and the nearest shelter was miles away. She had no bearings in this unfamiliar territory, and the pelting rain had reduced visibility to mere yards ahead. Her heart pounded against her ribs as another flash of lightning split the sky. Squinting through the downpour, Bethany tried to recall the landmarks she'd passed. There had been a creek, and beyond that, a copse of cottonwoods. But in the deluge, everything looked different, threatening rather than beautiful. She guided her horse toward what she hoped was the direction of town, but the animal shied at another clap of thunder. The rain was coming down so hard now that Bethany could barely see. Cold water trickled down her spine, and she shivered violently. Panic began to set in as she realized she might truly be lost. Then, through the curtain of rain, came the silhouette of a rider. A tall figure on horseback approached steadily through the storm, seemingly undeterred by the weather's fury. As the distance between them closed, Bethany could make out a broad-shouldered man beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his face partially obscured by a bandana pulled up against the elements. He pulled his horse alongside hers, and Bethany tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol concealed in her saddlebag. The Montana Territory was still wild, and she had heard enough stories of bandits and desperados to be wary of strangers. "Madam," the man called over the rain, pulling down his bandana. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes the color of the sky when it wasn't angry. "You shouldn't be out in this. Storm's only going to get worse." "I'm trying to get back to Helena," Bethany replied, raising her voice above the downpour. "But I fear I've lost my way." The stranger nodded, seeming to assess her situation quickly. "Helena's a good 8 miles northeast, and this rain ain't letting up anytime soon." He gestured to the south. "My ranch is just over that ridge, about 2 miles. You're welcome to wait out the storm there." Bethany hesitated, weighing her options. Stay with a stranger or brave the storm alone? Another bolt of lightning decided for her, striking a tree in the distance with a resounding crack that spooked both their horses. "Lead the way, sir," she conceded, pulling her sodden coat tighter around her shoulders. "Yates," the man said. "Yates Ashford." He tipped his hat, water cascading off the brim. "And you are?" "Bethany Darrow," she replied, feeling oddly formal despite her bedraggled appearance. Yates nodded and turned his horse. "Stay close, Miss Darrow. These trails get treacherous in the rain." Bethany followed Yates through the downpour, grateful for his silent confidence as he navigated the increasingly muddy path. He rode a chestnut stallion that moved with sure-footed precision even as the ground beneath them turned to slick mud. Occasionally, he would glance back to ensure she was keeping pace, offering a reassuring nod when their eyes met. The ride seemed interminable, the cold rain seeping deeper into Bethany's bones with each passing minute. Just as she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake in trusting this stranger, a structure emerged through the gray curtain of rain, a substantial ranch house with a wide porch and smoking chimney. "There she is," Yates called back to her. "Timber Creek Ranch." As they approached, Bethany could make out a large barn and several outbuildings spread across the property. It was larger than she had expected, speaking to a certain prosperity that surprised her. They rode directly to the barn, where Yates dismounted in one fluid motion and quickly came to help Bethany from her saddle. His hands were strong and sure as they circled her waist, and despite her exhaustion, Bethany felt a flutter of awareness at his touch. Up close, she could see that Yates Ashford was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps only a few years her senior, though his eyes held the experience of a much older man. "Thank you," she murmured as her feet touched the ground, her legs wobbly from cold and the long ride. "Let's get the horses settled, then get you by the fire," Yates said, already leading both animals into the barn shelter. Bethany followed, watching as he efficiently removed saddles and bridles, speaking softly to the horses as he rubbed them down with dry blankets. There was a gentleness to his movements that belied his rugged appearance. "You handle them well," she observed, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Yates offered a small smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Been around horses all my life. They understand honesty better than most people do." Once the horses were settled with feed and water, Yates led Bethany across the muddy yard to the main house. They climbed the steps to the covered porch, where he stomped his boots and removed his hat before opening the door for her. "Mrs. Finch?" he called as they entered. "We have a visitor who needs warming up." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, not lavish by any means, but well appointed with solid furniture and colorful woven rugs. A fire roared in a large stone hearth, and Bethany gravitated toward it immediately, holding out her trembling hands to the warmth. A plump older woman with silver-streaked hair emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her eyebrows rose at the sight of Bethany's bedraggled form. "Lord above, child, you're soaked through," she exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Yates Ashford, why did you not bring this poor girl straight inside?" "Horses needed tending, Mrs. Finch," Yates replied, a note of amusement in his voice. "Miss Darrow, this is Mrs. Finch, my housekeeper and the true ruler of Timber Creek." Mrs. Finch clicked her tongue disapprovingly but turned kind eyes to Bethany. "Come with me, dear. We need to get you out of those wet things before you catch your death." "I don't wish to impose," Bethany began, but Mrs. Finch was already ushering her toward a hallway. "Nonsense. No imposition at all. Yates, stoke that fire and put on some coffee." Yates nodded, amusement playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched them go. Mrs. Finch led Bethany to a bedroom at the end of the hall, opening a large trunk at the foot of the bed. "I keep some clothes here for emergencies," she explained, pulling out a simple but well-made dress. "This should fit you well enough until your things dry." "You're very kind," Bethany said, accepting the dress gratefully. "I'm afraid I made a terrible mistake riding out so far alone." Mrs. Finch's expression softened. "The Montana Territory isn't forgiving of mistakes, my dear, but you're safe now. Mr. Ashford is a good man, despite that rough exterior." She placed a towel and a basin of water on the dresser. "Get changed, and I'll have something hot waiting for you in the kitchen." Left alone, Bethany peeled off her sodden clothing with numb fingers. As circulation returned to her extremities, she became acutely aware of her situation alone in a strange man's home, miles from town. What would her brother think? What would proper Boston society say? But as she slipped into the dry dress and toweled her damp hair, Bethany couldn't summon the energy to care about propriety. She was alive, warm, and safe. And there had been something in Yates Ashford's steady gaze that inspired trust rather than fear. When Bethany emerged from the bedroom, feeling somewhat restored, she found Mrs. Finch in the kitchen ladling steaming soup into a bowl. "Sit, child," the older woman instructed, placing the bowl before her at a worn wooden table. "Nothing warms the body like good soup." The soup was rich with vegetables and chunks of beef, and Bethany realized how hungry she was as she took her first spoonful. "This is delicious, Mrs. Finch. Family recipe," the housekeeper replied with pride. "Been feeding it to Mr. Ashford since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." Bethany paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "You've known him that long?" Mrs. Finch nodded, settling into a chair across from Bethany. "I worked for his father, old Joseph Ashford. Started this ranch with nothing but grit and 20 head of cattle back in '48. Yates was born right here in this house in 1852. Lost his mother to fever when he was just 8, and his father passed 5 years ago. That boy's weathered more storms than most men twice his age. He seems capable," Bethany observed, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Finch chuckled. "That he is. Runs this place better than his father ever did, though don't tell him I said so. Timber Creek is one of the most successful ranches in the territory now." Before Bethany could inquire further, the subject of their conversation appeared in the doorway. Yates had changed into dry clothes as well, a clean flannel shirt and dark trousers that fit his tall frame well. His dark hair, damp from the rain, curled slightly at his temples. "Feeling better, Miss Darrow?" he asked, his deep voice filling the kitchen. "Much, thank you," Bethany replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance. Her hair must be a disaster, and she was wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large for her frame. If Yates noticed any deficiencies in her appearance, he gave no indication. Instead, he accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Finch and leaned against the doorframe. "Storm's settling in for the duration. Looks like you might be our guest until morning." Bethany's eyes widened. "Oh, but my brother, he'll be worried sick." "Walter Darrow, from the Mercantile?" Yates asked. Surprised, Bethany nodded. "You know him." "Montana Territory is still a small place in many ways. I do business with your brother fairly regularly." Yates took a sip of his coffee. "If the rain lets up a bit, I can send one of my ranch hands into town to let him know you're safe." Relief flooded through Bethany. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Ashford." "Yates," he corrected gently. "If you're going to be stuck here until the weather clears, we might as well dispense with formalities." Something in his tone made Bethany's cheeks warm, and she busied herself with another spoonful of soup to hide her reaction. "Yates, then. And you must call me Bethany." Mrs. Finch watched this exchange with knowing eyes before rising from the table. "I'll prepare the guest room for you, Miss Darrow. Yates, perhaps you could show our visitor the parlor once she's finished her meal. I imagine she'd like to sit by the fire and warm up properly." After Mrs. Finch departed, a comfortable silence settled between Bethany and Yates as she finished her soup. There was something oddly familiar about sitting in this kitchen with him, as though they'd shared many such moments before. "May I ask what took you so far from town today?" Yates finally inquired, settling into the chair Mrs. Finch had vacated. Bethany felt a flush of embarrassment. "Wildflowers," she admitted. "I've been collecting and pressing them since I arrived. I'd heard the prairie blooms were especially beautiful after rain, and I wanted to see them before they disappeared." To her surprise, Yates didn't laugh at her frivolous reason. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "They are at their best this time of year. The Indian paintbrush and prairie smoke are particularly fine on the north slopes." "You notice wildflowers?" Bethany couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. A slight smile touched Yates's lips. "My mother taught me their names when I was small. Said a man who knows the flowers knows when the land is healthy." He shrugged, as if embarrassed by the admission. Hard to forget those early lessons. The glimpse of sensitivity beneath Yates's stoic exterior intrigued Bethany. This man was clearly more than the rough cattleman he appeared to be. True to Mrs. Finch's suggestion, Yates led Bethany to the parlor after her meal. The room was comfortable rather than ostentatious, with well-worn leather chairs drawn up to the crackling fire and bookshelves lining one wall. "You have quite a library," Bethany observed, scanning the titles with interest. Books are rare out here, Yates replied, watching as she ran her fingers along the spines. Each one's a small treasure. Bethany pulled out a volume of Wordsworth's poetry, surprised to find such refined literature in a frontier ranch house. This was my mother's favorite, she said, opening to a familiar passage. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. Yates quoted softly from across the room. But she is in her grave, and, oh, the difference to me. Bethany looked up sharply, astonished. You know Wordsworth? A faint color touched Yates's tanned cheeks. My mother insisted I have more than just a rancher's education. She taught me herself until she died, then made my father promise to send me east for schooling. You were educated in the East? Bethany couldn't hide her surprise. Yates nodded, settling into one of the leather chairs. 4 years at a preparatory academy in New York, followed by 2 at Yale before my father fell ill and I had to return. He gestured for her to take the seat opposite him. I imagine that comes as a shock. I confess it does, Bethany admitted, sinking into the chair. The heat from the fire was deliciously soothing, and she found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. Most of the men I've met since arriving in Montana seem to pride themselves on their lack of formal education. Many do, Yates agreed, but you'll find all sorts out here: former soldiers, educated men fallen on hard times, adventurers, fugitives. The territory attracts those looking for a second chance or a fresh start. He regarded her curiously. What brought you to Helena, if I may ask? It's a long way from Boston. Bethany hesitated, considering how much to share with this man she barely knew. Yet something about Yates Ashford's direct gaze encouraged honesty. My brother Walter moved here after the war, she began. He was changed by his experiences. Boston held too many memories, too many expectations. He wrote that he'd found peace in Montana, and after our parents passed last year, there was nothing keeping me in Boston. She smiled slightly. I was expected to make an advantageous marriage, but the prospect of becoming some wealthy man's ornament held little appeal. So you chose adventure instead, Yates observed. I chose freedom, Bethany corrected gently. The freedom to determine my own path. Lightning flashed outside the window, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the house. The storm was directly overhead now, rain lashing against the glass panes with renewed fury. It appears the sky isn't clearing anytime soon, Yates remarked, rising to add another log to the fire. You're welcome to stay as long as necessary. I hope I won't be imposing for long, Bethany replied, though I must thank you again for your hospitality. I dread to think what might have happened had you not found me. The territory is unforgiving, but its people usually aren't, Yates said, poking at the fire. Most would have done the same. Perhaps, Bethany allowed, but it was you who did. Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits, despite their different backgrounds. The moment stretched, interrupted only when Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway. I've prepared the guest room, Miss Darrow, she announced, and managed to find a nightdress that should fit you well enough. Thank you, Mrs. Finch, Bethany replied, reluctantly breaking her gaze from Yates's. You've been exceedingly kind. Just doing my Christian duty, the housekeeper responded, though her eyes twinkled with something more knowing. Now, I've got a batch of fresh biscuits about to come out of the oven. Would either of you care for some with honey? The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly as the storm continued its assault outside. Mrs. Finch's biscuits were indeed delicious, and Bethany found herself relaxing in the company of these strangers who had so quickly made her feel welcome. Yates proved to be an engaging conversationalist, well-informed on current events, despite the ranch's relative isolation. As the mantel clock struck 9, however, Bethany found herself stifling yawns. I believe our guest is ready for rest, Mrs. Finch observed. "It's been quite a day for you, my dear." "Indeed it has," Bethany agreed, rising from her chair. "Good night, Mrs. Finch." "Good night, Yates." "Sleep well, Bethany," Yates replied, his voice lower than it had been during their earlier conversation. "Perhaps the morning will bring clearer skies." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains that Mrs. Finch had drawn against the storm. As Bethany changed into the borrowed nightdress and slipped between cool sheets, she found her thoughts lingering on her host. There was something compelling about Yates Ashford, a complexity she hadn't expected to find in a Montana rancher. The combination of his frontier capability and Eastern education made him unlike anyone she had met before. Sleep came quickly, lulled by the rhythm of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder as the storm slowly moved eastward. Bethany woke to sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up, pushing her tangled hair from her face. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Miss Darrow, are you awake?" It was Mrs. Finch's voice. "Yes." "Come in," Bethany called, pulling the quilt up to maintain her modesty. Mrs. Finch entered with a steaming pitcher of water. "Good morning, dear. I've brought you hot water for washing, and your clothes are clean and pressed." She laid a neat stack on the chair by the dresser. "Breakfast will be ready whenever you are." "What time is it?" Bethany asked, embarrassed at the thought of having slept late. "Just past 7, Mrs. Finch assured her. "The rain stopped around midnight, and it's shaping up to be a beautiful day." After Mrs. Finch departed, Bethany rose and washed quickly, grateful to change back into her own riding clothes. They had been thoroughly cleaned and pressed, smelling faintly of lavender. The care someone, presumably Mrs. Finch, had taken with her garments touched her deeply. When Bethany entered the kitchen, she found Yates already at the table, a cup of coffee before him and a ledger open at his elbow. He looked up as she entered, and Bethany was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes. "Good morning," he greeted her, closing the ledger. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," Bethany replied, taking the seat Mrs. Finch indicated. "Your home is most comfortable." "Glad to hear it." Yates gestured to the window where sunlight streamed in. The storms moved on, as they always do. Mrs. Finch placed a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before Bethany. "Eat up, child. Nothing worse than traveling on an empty stomach." "You're very kind," Bethany said, realizing she was indeed hungry. "Both of you have been so hospitable." "I sent word to your brother first thing this morning," Yates informed her between sips of coffee. "Miguel rode into town at dawn. Walter knows you're safe, and that I'll be escorting you back to Helena personally." "Oh," Bethany said, surprised by the offer. "That's not necessary. I'm sure I can find my way now that the weather has cleared." "Perhaps," Yates conceded, "but I'd rest easier knowing you arrived safely. Besides, I have business in town." Mrs. Finch made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh as she turned back to her stove. Bethany had the distinct impression that Yates's business in Helena was a recent development. "Then I gratefully accept your escort," Bethany replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They set out an hour later after Bethany had thanked Mrs. Finch profusely for her kindness. The morning was gloriously clear, the storm having washed the world clean. Wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, their colors vibrant against the verdant grass. "It's beautiful," Bethany remarked as they rode side by side across the rolling prairie, as though the storm never happened. "That's Montana for you," Yates replied, his expression softening as he surveyed the landscape. "Violent one moment, peaceful the next. You never know quite what you're going to get, but it's always honest." "Is that why you stayed? After Yale, I mean." Bethany was curious about the man who seemed equally at home discussing poetry and managing a cattle ranch. Yates considered her question thoughtfully. Partly, I came back for my father initially, but after he passed, I could have sold the ranch, returned east. But this land gets in your blood. He gestured to the expansive vista before them. Out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his family is or how he speaks. There's a freedom in that I never found in the East. I understand that sentiment, Bethany said quietly. Boston society can be suffocating in its expectations, particularly for women. Yates glanced at her, his expression unreadable. And what do you expect from your life in Montana, Bethany Darrow? The directness of his question caught her off guard, but Bethany found herself answering honestly. I'm not entirely sure yet. Something more than what was laid out for me in Boston. A chance to discover who I am beyond the roles assigned to me. A worthy pursuit, Yates nodded. Though not without its challenges in a place like this. All worthwhile things involve challenges, don't they? Bethany replied. A smile tugged at Yates's mouth. Indeed they do. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to the birdsong overhead. Occasionally, Yates would point out landmarks or name a particular wildflower they passed, and Bethany found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet confidence and surprising depth. As they crested a hill, Helena came into view in the distance, its buildings clustered along Last Chance Gulch. The sight brought a mix of emotions for Bethany: relief at returning to familiar surroundings, but also a curious reluctance to end this unexpected journey. We should reach town by noon, Yates observed, guiding his horse down the gentle slope. Yes, Bethany replied, unable to keep a note of regret from her voice. Yates cast her a sidelong glance. Your brother's mercantile is hosting a social gathering next Saturday evening, is it not? Surprised by the question, Bethany nodded. Yes, Walter is trying to establish it as a monthly tradition. He believes it helps build community. Would you find it presumptuous if I attended? Yates asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on her. Bethany felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. Not at all. I would welcome your presence. Now Yates did look at her, a slow smile transforming his weathered face. Then I'll be there. The rest of the journey passed too quickly for Bethany's liking. As they rode into Helena, she became acutely aware of the curious glances thrown their way. Bethany Darrow, the Boston newcomer, riding alongside Yates Ashford, one of the territory's most eligible bachelors, was certain to set tongues wagging. They stopped outside Walter's mercantile, where her brother rushed out to meet them, relief evident on his face. Beth! He exclaimed, helping her dismount. I was beside myself with worry until Ashford's man brought word this morning. I'm perfectly fine, Walter, Bethany assured him, thanks entirely to Mr. Ashford's timely intervention. Walter turned to Yates, who had also dismounted. I'm indebted to you, Ashford. If anything had happened to my sister— No debt necessary, Darrow, Yates replied, tipping his hat. Anyone would have done the same. Nevertheless, you must join us for dinner tonight, Walter insisted. Allow me to express my gratitude properly. Yates's eyes flickered to Bethany before he responded. I'd be honored. As Walter ushered Bethany inside with a flurry of concerned questions, she glanced back to see Yates watching her, his expression thoughtful. Something had begun between them during that stormy afternoon and clear morning ride, something unexpected but undeniably promising. The week leading up to the social gathering passed in a blur of anticipation for Bethany. Dinner at Walter's home the evening after her return had been a pleasant affair, with Yates charming her brother with his knowledge of cattle markets and territorial politics. The way his eyes sought hers across the table, however, suggested his true interest lay elsewhere. When Saturday evening finally arrived, Bethany took unusual care with her appearance, selecting a blue dress that matched her eyes and arranging her auburn hair in an elegant style she hadn't bothered with since leaving Boston. Walter raised an eyebrow at her efforts, but made no comment as they walked to the Mercantile together. The store had been transformed for the occasion, shelves pushed back to create space for dancing, and lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small group of local musicians played in one corner, while tables laden with food and drink lined another wall. Already, the room was filling with Helena's residents, from miners and shopkeepers to the few professional men the growing town boasted. Bethany scanned the crowd, trying not to appear too eager, but her heart sank as the minutes passed with no sign of Yates. Perhaps he had changed his mind, or ranch business had detained him. "Looking for someone in particular?" a familiar voice asked from behind her, and Bethany turned to find Yates standing there, looking more polished than she had yet seen him. He wore a clean white shirt beneath a well-cut jacket, and his dark hair was neatly combed. "Mr. Ashford," she greeted him, unable to suppress her smile. "I wasn't certain you would come." "I gave my word, didn't I?" he replied, his eyes warm as they took in her appearance. "You look beautiful, Bethany." The directness of his compliment brought heat to her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. High praise from a Boston lady. The music shifted to a waltz, and Yates held out his hand. "Would you care to dance?" Bethany placed her gloved hand in his. "I would indeed." As Yates led her onto the improvised dance floor, Bethany was aware of the curious glances directed their way. The sophisticated newcomer and the cattle rancher made an unexpected pair. But as Yates's arm circled her waist and he guided her smoothly into the waltz, she found she didn't care what anyone thought. "You dance very well," she observed, surprised by his skill. "Yale hosted its share of formal events," he replied with a hint of amusement. "Though I admit I'm out of practice." "I wouldn't have known," Bethany assured him. As they moved together to the music, the crowded room seemed to fade away until it felt as though they were alone. There was an ease between them that belied their short acquaintance, as if they had known each other far longer than a mere week. "I've thought about you often since our ride," Yates admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Have you?" Bethany responded, her heart quickening. "More than is probably wise," he said with a small smile. "Wisdom seems overrated at times," Bethany replied boldly, surprising herself with her forwardness. Yates's eyes darkened slightly. "Bethany Darrow, you are unlike any woman I've ever met." "I hope that's a compliment," she said, suddenly uncertain. "The highest," he assured her, his hand tightening slightly at her waist. The waltz ended too soon, and reluctantly, they parted. But throughout the evening, Bethany was constantly aware of Yates's presence across the room. When he wasn't dancing with her, which was often enough to raise eyebrows, he engaged easily with the townspeople, clearly respected by those who knew him. As the gathering began to wind down, Yates found her again. "May I walk you home?" he asked, offering his arm. "I would like that," Bethany replied, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. They said their goodbyes to Walter, who gave Yates a measuring look before nodding his approval. The night air was cool but pleasant as they strolled through Helena's streets, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear sky. "What a difference from the last time we saw each other," Bethany remarked, glancing upward. "No storms in sight tonight." "Nature's moods are fickle," Yates replied, "but I find I'm grateful for that rainstorm, despite the danger it put you in." "As am I," Bethany admitted softly, "though perhaps not for the scare it gave me." They reached the small house Bethany shared with Walter at the edge of town. On the porch, sheltered by shadows, Bethany turned to face Yates, suddenly shy despite the connection they had forged. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Ashford," she said formally, falling back on her Boston manners. Yates, he corrected gently, stepping closer. I think we're well past formalities, don't you? Bethany looked up at him, at the strong lines of his face softened by moonlight. Yates, she agreed. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. Bethany, he murmured. I find myself in an unusual position. I've never been one to rush into things. But since meeting you... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Yes? She prompted, barely breathing. I'd like to court you properly, Yates said finally, if you're amenable. Relief and joy flooded through Bethany. I am very amenable, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Yates's smile was slow and beautiful. May I kiss you then? To seal our understanding? In answer, Bethany rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Yates's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both were breathless. I'll call on you tomorrow, Yates promised, his voice husky. Perhaps we could ride out to see those wildflowers you're so fond of with your brother's permission, of course. I'd like that, Bethany replied, her heart full to bursting. Though perhaps we'll check the weather forecast first. Yates laughed softly, the sound warming her more thoroughly than any fire. A wise precaution. Good night, Bethany Darrow. Good night, Yates Ashford, she whispered, watching as he descended the porch steps and disappeared into the Montana night. In the months that followed, Bethany found herself living a life she could never have imagined in Boston. Her courtship with Yates progressed steadily, each encounter deepening their connection. They rode together across the vast Montana landscape, shared meals with Walter and Mrs. Finch, attended church socials and territorial celebrations. Yates introduced Bethany to the operations of Timber Creek Ranch, teaching her about cattle breeding and land management with the same patience he showed his ranch hands. In turn, Bethany shared her passion for literature and botany, creating a growing collection of pressed wildflowers that decorated the walls of Yates's study. As autumn approached, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in gold and crimson, Yates took Bethany to a special spot on his property, a ridge overlooking the entire valley, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. This is breathtaking, Bethany said as they dismounted. How have you never brought me here before? I was saving it, Yates replied mysteriously, taking her hand and leading her to a flat rock perfect for sitting. They settled side by side, the October sun warming them despite the crisp air. Below, Timber Creek wound through the valley like a silver ribbon, while in the distance, the ranch buildings looked like a child's toys. I come here to think, Yates explained, his thumb tracing circles on the back of Bethany's hand, when decisions need making or problems need solving. And what problem brings us here today? Bethany asked, sensing something significant in his manner. Yates turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had seen it in some time. No problem, he said softly. But a decision? Yes. Before Bethany could respond, Yates slid from the rock to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. Her heart began to race as she realized what was happening. Bethany Darrow, Yates began, his usually steady voice trembling slightly. When you rode into my life that stormy day, I had no idea how completely you would change everything. You've brought laughter and learning and love to places that had been empty for too long. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. This was my mother's, he explained. I've kept it all these years, waiting for someone worthy of it waiting, though I didn't know it, for you. His blue eyes locked with hers. Bethany, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears sprang to Bethany's eyes, blurring her vision. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Yates Ashford, I will marry you. Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of a future together. When they finally parted, Bethany rested her head against Yates's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I never imagined when I came west that I would find not just freedom, but love as well. And I never imagined that a rainstorm would deliver my greatest blessing, Yates replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They were married on a clear December day, with snow dusting the mountains and evergreen boughs decorating the small Helena church. Walter gave Bethany away with tears in his eyes, while Mrs. Finch beamed from the front pew, dabbing at her own tears with a lace handkerchief. Bethany wore a gown of ivory satin that had been her mother's, altered to suit her more modern tastes, while Yates cut a handsome figure in a new suit ordered specially from Denver. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising to cherish and support each other through whatever storms life might bring. The celebration afterward at Timber Creek Ranch brought together people from across the territory, ranchers and townspeople, cowboys and merchants, all sharing in the couple's happiness. As night fell and lanterns were lit, Yates pulled Bethany onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Ashford?" he murmured as they waltzed. "Deliriously so, Mr. Ashford," she replied, her eyes shining with joy. Later, as the last guests departed and the newly wedded couple stood on the porch of what was now their home together, Bethany looked up at the clear night sky, stars brilliant against the darkness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if it hadn't rained that day?" she asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. Yates considered this, his arm tightening around her waist. "I like to think we would have found each other anyway," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, rain or shine." Bethany turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "I believe you're right," she whispered before their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Spring had returned to Montana Territory by the time Bethany made the joyful discovery that she was expecting their first child. The wildflowers were just beginning to peek through the last patches of snow when she shared the news with Yates one evening as they sat before the fire in their parlor. His reaction first stunned silence, then overwhelming joy was everything she could have hoped for. As he knelt before her chair, resting his head gently against her still flat stomach, Bethany ran her fingers through his dark hair and marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a single year. "I love you," Yates whispered, looking up at her with eyes shining. "Both of you." Their daughter, Catherine Rose Ashford, was born on a stormy November night with Mrs. Finch and the local midwife attending. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and from her first cry, she held both parents in the palm of her tiny hand. As Yates held his daughter for the first time, looking down at her perfect face with wonder, Bethany knew she had found everything she had ever sought: freedom, purpose, love, and now, family. "Welcome to the world, little one," Yates murmured to the baby. "You are so very loved." Life at Timber Creek Ranch settled into a new rhythm with Catherine's arrival. Bethany embraced motherhood while continuing to assist Yates with the ranch's business affairs, putting her Boston education to good use in managing the accounts and correspondence. Together, they built not just a successful enterprise, but a true home. On Catherine's first birthday, as the family celebrated with Walter and Mrs. Finch, Bethany found herself remembering the rainstorm that had changed the course of her life. How frightened she had been, how lost and alone. And then Yates had appeared through the curtain of rain, steady and reassuring, guiding her to safety. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, finding her by the window as Catherine squealed with delight over the wooden horse Walter had carved for her. "The day we met," Bethany replied, leaning into him as his arms encircled her from behind. How fortunate I was to get caught in that storm. Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. I'm the fortunate one, he corrected softly. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. To us, Bethany amended, turning in his arms to face him. The best thing that ever happened to us. As the years passed, the Ashford family grew with the addition of a son, James Walter Ashford, born on a clear summer morning 2 years after Catherine. Timber Creek Ranch prospered under Yates and Bethany's joint management, expanding its operations and earning a reputation throughout the territory for fair dealing and quality stock. Bethany's wildflower collection grew as well, eventually becoming so extensive that Yates built her a special room adjoining their bedroom where she could work on her botanical studies. Her carefully pressed and labeled specimens drew the attention of a professor from back east, who encouraged her to publish her observations of Montana's flora. The publication of Wildflowers of the Montana Territory, under the name Bethany Darrow Ashford, brought a kind of recognition Bethany had never sought but found deeply satisfying, not as someone's daughter or sister or even wife, but as herself. Through it all, through the joys and inevitable sorrows that life brings, Bethany and Yates remained each other's steadfast companions. Their love, born in a rainstorm and nurtured through clear skies and cloudy days alike, only deepened with the passing seasons. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Bethany with a journey back to the ridge where he had proposed. Though they were no longer young silver threading through his dark hair, laugh lines crinkling the corners of her eyes, they made the ride with the same enjoyment they had always found in each other's company. At the ridge, a picnic had been prepared, with a bottle of champagne chilling in a bucket. You've thought of everything, Bethany said appreciatively as Yates helped her dismount. 20 years deserves proper celebration, he replied, leading her to the blanket spread beneath the same tree where he had asked for her hand. They settled side by side, looking out over the land they had nurtured together. Timber Creek Ranch had grown substantially, now employing dozens of men and running several thousand head of cattle. Their home had been expanded to accommodate not just their family, but frequent visitors, including Walter, who had retired from the mercantile and now spent much of his time with his niece and nephew. Did you ever imagine, that day in the rain, that we would build all this together? Bethany asked, accepting a glass of champagne from her husband. Yates considered the question, his blue eyes still as striking as the day they met scanning the vista before them. I knew there was something special about you from the moment I saw you on that rain-soaked trail, he said finally. But this? He gestured to the flourishing ranch below them. This exceeds even my most hopeful dreams. Mine as well, Bethany admitted, raising her glass. To 20 years of building dreams together. And to 20 more, Yates added, touching his glass to hers. As they sipped their champagne, Bethany reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a frightened young woman caught in a Montana downpour to the confident ranch mistress and published botanist she had become. From the educated cattleman riding through a storm to the respected patriarch Yates, was now they had grown and changed together, always supporting each other's aspirations. I love you, Yates Ashford, Bethany said simply, reaching for his hand. More with each passing year. And I love you, Bethany Darrow Ashford, he replied, raising her hand to his lips, more than words could ever express. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the couple remained on their ridge, talking quietly of memories shared and dreams still to fulfill. When at last they rode home in the gathering twilight, it was with the comfortable silence of those who know each other's thoughts without words. Catherine, now 19 and as spirited as her mother had once been, was waiting on the porch with her younger brother James. Behind them, Mrs. Finch, now white-haired but still spry, supervised the final preparations for the anniversary dinner she had insisted on cooking despite her age. Happy anniversary! The children called in unison as Bethany and Yates approached, looking at their beloved faces, at the home they had built together, at the man who had ridden beside her through both literal and metaphorical storms for 20 years. Bethany felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, embracing first her daughter, then her son, "for making this day so special." Later, as the family gathered around the table that had hosted so many celebrations and ordinary moments alike, Walter raised his glass in a toast. "To my sister and the man who found her in a rainstorm," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have built something truly remarkable together." "To Bethany and Yates," the others echoed, glasses raised high. As night fell over Timber Creek Ranch, as their children and Walter and Mrs. Finch retired, leaving them alone in the parlor where they had first discovered their shared love of poetry, Bethany and Yates stood by the window, watching as clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain by morning. "Another storm coming," Bethany observed, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "Let it come," Yates replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "We've weathered plenty together." "And we'll weather many more," Bethany added with certainty. Outside, the first drops began to fall, pattering against the glass. But inside, wrapped in the warmth of their enduring love, Bethany and Yates Ashford were exactly where they belonged together, come rain or shine, for all the days of their lives.